to Rising. So nice to have you with us for this excellent day of important news. Hello, Briahna.
Hello, Robby.
I'm a little distracted because the group chat is just lots to weigh in on this morning of our plans to see both Barbie and Oppenheimer. We're going to do it.
Have you settled in on an order?
I think we're seeing Barbie, then Oppenheimer, even though in my head the reverse would be the correct order.
I feel like that's a mistake. I think you're going to need a palate cleanser after the heaviness.
Well, we have lunch
Oppenheimer
planned for in between.
Okay.
Lunch and drinks.
Well, you'll be in the right mood for a Barbie movie then. Yeah.
Excellent. What's going on?
Well, we'll discuss up today the mainstream media's reaction to former President Donald Trump and the fact that he may be indicted for a third time. Plus, we'll get into new developments into the investigation into Tupac Shakur's murder. But first, we are going to get into what we learned yesterday from Michael Shellenberger to dig into that, reporting further about how the Biden administration formally moved to subpoena federal funding of the Wuhan Institute of Virology for 10 years. A Department of Health and Human Services memo says the lab stonewalled safety and regulation documentation requests, and the lab's quote, immediate suspension is necessary to mitigate potential public health risk. Per HHS, the department, quote, aims to ensure that the Wuhan lab does not receive another dollar of federal funding.
Now, according to a department spokesperson, the Virology Institute has not actually received new NIH cash since July of 2020. Bloomberg News, which first broke this story, reports that the Wuhan Institute of Virology has racked up more than $1.4 million in federal awards since 2014. Now, this, of course, comes after bombshell reporting, as you noted, Briahna, that we discussed with Michael Shellenberger yesterday, having to do with the top scientists involved in proximal origins, the explanation for how COVID didn't come from a lab, it came naturally from the wild, and how that has been misrepresented and covered up by these scientists who are now being called out for all these messages that Michael Shellenberger, Matt Taibbi, and others have uncovered, showing that they very much thought a lab leak was extremely possible and were pushed to say otherwise by Dr. Fauci and co. So I think this news is hugely everyone's like breathing a sigh of relief that finally we are formally not doing this kind of funding anymore. A lot of people saying now.
Yeah.
It means we were doing this funding up till now. Now, that's not quite the case. They did informally stop doing grants since 2020. Now, this is the official no, and it's a 10-year ban on funding this kind of research in Wuhan. It's interesting to note their official reason for doing it now is they said they've asked the Wuhan Institute of Virology for documents relating to their safety procedures, for more information on what's going on there. And they didn't get a response. So that, itself is it's not like this lab or the people at this lab are saying, we have nothing to hide and we want funding to continue, so we'll show you what we have going on and we can improve standards if you find things deficient. They're not doing that. They don't want any closer examination of what the practices were like, what safety issues were going on. They don't want any additional scrutiny. Of course, it's very indicative of the fact that they have something to hide.
Yeah, I mean, throughout this process, I feel like there has been a lot of ambiguity around whether or not the safety protocols that were in place at the Wuhan lab were sufficient for the level of danger inherent to the research that was being done. And we were covering the latest hearing on this subject, congressional hearing on this subject. One of the witnesses was being asked about those safety protocols, and even still, as recently as last week, was giving answers that were somewhat prevaricating. They're saying, there's different safety standards, and it depends on what the research is, and yada, yada, yada. And it's like, well, we are now 3 years into a global pandemic. I think there is a on its face argument that whatever safety protocols were in practice were not sufficient. And instead of having the attitude that we are on the ball, that we want to rectify whatever the situation was, that, even if it wasn't a lab leak situation, there's enough, ambiguity about it that we need to obviously change the way that things are being done now, because there should be no question that something like this could originate in a lab. That doesn't seem to have been the attitude. So I do think that there are people that are going to breathe a sigh of relief that there is this official end to the funding. What that means from the scientific community side about whether or not there is still useful funding that should be done, and that it should be done under better safety protocols, protocols instead of shutting the whole thing down. I'm sure that will be an ongoing conversation.
It should be done in Antarctica or on a satellite orbiting the moon or somewhere.
Get Elon Musk on it. It'll be the first task of the Mars colony.
Yeah, so it's not, and we've had all these government oversight reports showing that the funds were not, the grants were not subjected to the additional layers of scrutiny that they should have been. There should also be, so Republicans, in addition to this, they're saying this doesn't go far enough. EcoHealth Alliance, which is the grant managing organization very involved in this, should also be suspended from doing any grants. I want a total shutdown of all of this until we know what's going on.
Sure. I mean, and that's a difficult position to take when the government has said, well, basically thrown up its hands and said, well, we'll never know. It'll be difficult for us to ever ascertain. So if you are a doctor, I can imagine in this scenario where you do feel like there is beneficial research to be done, you're going to be reluctant to agree to that standard until we know what's going on, if you don't believe that the government is really invested in being clear about resolving what actually happened here, either because of liability reasons or geopolitical implications, as we talked about last week, where there was this urgency to not blame China early on because of what that would mean for the geopolitical relationship there. But at this point, I think doctors have dug themselves into a bit of a hole because having been so tight-lipped on the discovery of the origins, people aren't willing to give them that much discretion or benefit of the doubt if they do now say, well, there's some good research to still be done here. The time to prove that you were willing to be open and transparent was over the last 3 years, and the interest seemingly in protecting one's own discipline over the course of that time, I think has made many people indifferent to what they have to say with respect to arguments about what research there is still to be done.
Right. And again, it's just so frustrating to see this become a intrinsically political question of where you think COVID came from and what, the Republicans are all about the lab leak theory and Democrats are, broadly speaking, not, even though there's no political necessity to take those positions. President Barack Obama paused gain-of-function research after finding out more about what was going on. Fauci did it anyway, using loopholes carved into that pause. And Biden early on was concerned about the lack of transparency from the Chinese government. We didn't need to fall into this partisan posturing where you're like, if you're a Democratic official, you're just deigning to trust whatever the scientists say, even though they have this obvious incentive to downplay their own involvement. And if you're a Republican, you're taking this very hawkish toward China position and being all in on the lab leak theory, which I do think the lab leak theory is much more likely at this point. It's not definitively proven, and we need to look for more evidence. And if evidence did come in to suggest a different origin, that's absolutely fine, and we should, just passionately pursue the truth wherever it takes us. But there's nothing partisan at stake about it. This is an indictment of a foreign government and also our own government, and not a political party, of government employees, of funding for science, of a class of federal government bureaucrats who are not political, who are not elected, who don't have R's and D's next to their name. So why it had to be like this is discouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll have more Rising for you right after this.